Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on the show. I'm really excited. Why don't you give yourself a little synopsis who you are,
Mhm.
what it is you do day in, day out, what you're passionate about, and then we can kind of maybe look at some of your history.
Sure. So my name is Halley Kim. I started going through a faith deconstruction experience about 5 years ago. Um, I have three little kids. I'm a registered nurse, live with my husband and my family in St. Louis, Missouri. And a little over a year ago, I just felt compelled to start writing about faith deconstruction and trying to find community around that, because it was a really hard, lonely experience. And, I've just become more and more passionate about helping other people connect in that kind of experience and
Sure.
figure out like what is happening to me and what does this mean and can I ask these questions and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure lots of people listening are like nodding along. Yep. That's my experience, like asking these questions, rattling around in my head. Is this
Right.
okay? Even never mind, what terrifying answers am I going to come up with? Wow.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you started that journey about 5 years ago. So where
Mhm.
did you start out before that? Like, have you had a pretty static kind of journey spirituality wise up until then? Were you in the same sort of
Well,
traditions, or did you have quite a meandering?
so I did not grow up in church.
Okay.
My parents are not religious. At least by the time they were my parents, they weren't religious. And my grandmother was very spiritual, though, and she just was kind of equal opportunity. Like she had a pendant of Mary that she wore around her neck, but she also like read the Talmud and was interested in Buddhism and
Wow.
just Eastern philosophy in general and alternative healing modalities and
Mm.
um, so I was exposed to that growing up. She had this special blessing that she would say over us before we left her house. And um, but my parents didn't take us to church. We celebrated Easter and Christmas, but it wasn't religious. And then I became a Christian when I was in high school through Young Life. I was a big Young Life kid, which is a parachurch ministry here in the U.S. Maybe it's well, like, I guess it's more than the U.S., but that I was like all about that in high school. And I came home from camp and I told my mom, like, Jesus died for me. And I was like, this was like brand new information to
Yeah.
me.
Wow.
And and my mom was very, very upset.
Oh, that's
She I know now that she had already had her own deconstruction journey.
Mm,
Um, but I had no appreciation of that. And, at this point, I didn't have any like spiritual baggage,
right.
didn't know what that was. And I was just like, Jesus is awesome. What's your problem?
Yeah. Had she not
And
talked about that much growing up, having had a faith and then come out of it? Um, you know, I guess there's multiple ways as a parent you kind of like then bring up kids, right? You can bring kids and just
yeah,
be like, well, I don't believe anything anymore, or that. And so I'm just not going to teach
right.
about it, talk about it. Or a lot of people become quite militant almost on the flip side, right? And go, oh, I'm going to
Uh-huh.
make sure my kids never fall for this deception, or different ways that people could
Hmm.
see it. Was that a conversation that would go around the family table talking about faith and religion at all, as you remember?
I have no memories of that coming up at
Mm,
all before I was in high school. Yeah.
yeah.
I think my mom, hoped that I would never, you know, become influenced by religion.
Yeah.
That's just not what happened. That was like really my teenage rebellion. Like
Yeah.
I
It's
used to
funny,
hide
isn't
my Bible
it?
under my pillow and like lie about going to church. Like there was a lot of friction between me and my mom
Yeah.
around me
Wow.
being a Christian. Um, and then, I also didn't realize this at the time, but I was not only becoming a Christian, but an evangelical.
Mm,
Um, got involved in church and the the EPC was the denomination, and did campus ministries in college and was just like really on fire for Jesus and all of that. And then I started dating my husband when I was in my mid-20s, and he was a pastor.
Oh, wow.
He is a
Okay.
pastor. And
Was he pastor of a church you were a part of, or had you kind of like
well, kind of
shopped
sort
around
of.
to
So
another church? Or
the very first church I started attending when I was 16 was the same church that my husband was eventually the youth pastor of. But
okay,
he wasn't there when I was there. So we were introduced by mutual friends. We started dating, and then I, started going back to that church that I had been a part of when I was in high school.
sure.
Dating a pastor is super weird. People are strange about it. I not having come from a religious background was really ignorant to like the pastor's wife thing. Like
Right.
I didn't know that was a thing. And I thought that was something I could just sort of opt out of. I was like, oh, that's silly. Like, whatever. Yeah, he's a pastor. So what? And it wasn't really until we got married and, I became immersed in like ministry world by being, by virtue of being married to him, that I started to see like, oh no, like people have some really strong ideas about like who I'm supposed to be and how I'm supposed to act and what I'm supposed to do. Which was really just honestly shocking to me. And and I'm not really so much for like social norms and like following rules. And so it didn't work super well. And then when I had my second child, so my oldest is a boy, and then when I had my second, a girl, this was about 5 years ago, and that's when the wheels kind of started coming off for me. At that point, I was asking questions about women and women's roles and why can't women be pastors and what's that about again? And, the idea of submitting, to one's husband and all of that. Like it was the theology that I had been willing to accept for myself, I couldn't for my daughter.
Yeah, gosh. That's a common thing I come across is people having a daughter. We had someone on probably about a month ago now who was talking about that they themselves and even their wife to some degree, who was quite outspoken about, women's rights, quite feminist kind of views, and yet was kind of willing to kind of check that at the door, a few times a week. And yet when they had a daughter, I think they only have one child, but when they had the daughter, it was like, hold on, I'm willing to do this, but am I willing for my kid to do this in 20 years, 5 years, God knows how early, like, right?
Totally.
So what was it, do you think, that how did you kind of talk yourself out of that being an issue for yourself, right? Because you obviously had some conflicting opinions on what a woman should be doing as a pastor's wife versus what was required of.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as is, standard for evangelicals, I thought the Bible was inerrant. So, I mean, I was one of those Christians who just marked up her Bible like crazy. Like, when I was given my first Bible in college or in high school, it was like, this is God's love letter to you. It was, and I'm such a romantic by nature. Like I loved that idea. Like, oh, this is for me and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, and I remember writing like next to, in Second Timothy or First Timothy, is it First Timothy 2? Yeah. I can't even remember anymore.
Yeah.
About, a woman should not, teach a man and blah, blah. And I wrote in the margin, like, help God. Like, I know I'm supposed to like agree with this or be okay with this because it's inerrant and it's your word, but I'm not. And this is mean and this is painful and I don't like this. So there was this weird tension between what I knew I was supposed to think and believe and what I really thought and believed.
Sure.
And because I didn't grow up in church, I think that like my serving of the Kool-Aid, if you will, was not as deep as, you know, tall of a glass. And, you know, I'd seen, you know, my grandmother had modeled that there were other ways to think and believe. I was quite aware, because of my family, that not everyone was Christian and that not everyone agreed with Christianity. But if, you know, it had been and was and is so meaningful to me, that I didn't, there was no concept of like, permission though to like really wrestle with scripture and be, you know, like you're not supposed to pick and choose, like that whole thing. So, and there had been a couple of other things leading up to the birth of my daughter that in hindsight were also kind of like chinks in the armor. Like I used to be a doula, so working with women in labor, you know, giving birth to their children. It's, you know, really fulfilling work. And I had this really traumatic experience in which one of my doula clients died in the immediate postpartum, and her baby died too. And it was incredibly traumatic. And I happened to know that she was an atheist. We had talked about it that day, like when she was in early labor.
Wow.
So then she dies and her baby dies. And according to my theology, I was supposed to believe that she was in hell and her baby was in heaven. And that was excruciating. Yeah. And I was just like, this is so wrong. This is horrible. And, you know, through being a nurse and a doula, you know, I was very passionate about the importance of like the mother-baby bond and that connection. And I was also pregnant with my first child. Like, it was just like a lot. And I was like, this is not okay. And my therapist at the time, who was a Christian, you know, introduced the idea of post-mortem salvation to me, like the possibility of that. And at the time, that was enough for me to be like, you know, okay, like maybe there's a way that this mother and baby won't be separated forever. But that was, you know, that had a pretty big impact on me of kind of shaking my foundation. And then a few years later, when I started really questioning women's roles and women's submission, I don't know, just in hindsight, it feels like some things lined up that made me open to those questions.
Maybe created a few cracks in that foundation. Like,
yeah. I read Sarah Bessey's book, Jesus Feminist.
Yeah.
And it made me really mad before it kind of set me free. Because I was like, oh, great, Sarah, like this sounds awesome, but you know, the Bible doesn't agree with you. Yeah. And, you know, I'm married to a complementarian pastor. Like, what do you want me to do, Sarah? But
did you feel trapped in some senses in that dynamic? Because I know that that's a common dynamic when people start to open up themselves a bit to questioning, or at least start realizing some of my answers aren't as they don't satisfy in the same way. So I don't feel free to question, but I at least know my answers aren't making me as like complicit and happy and nod along every day. But there's a lot at stake in my question. It's not just, you know, even like the Bible or my relationship with God. It's my relationship with my husband. It's my husband's job.
Oh, yeah.
You know, there's a whole dynamic, especially for people like pastors, families. Like,
yes,
that's a big dynamic.
Yes. I mean, I think faith deconstruction is really hard and scary for anyone. But when you are a professional Christian or married to one or the child of one, it's a whole other ball of wax.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much more on the line. Yeah. Because, you know, whether they should or not, people associate you with the person you're married to. You know, so how did I reflect on my husband? And I mean, I didn't start writing about deconstruction until after my husband was no longer working in vocational ministry. And there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I just was terrified, and I, you know, knew that I could not be my authentic self And it just got worse and worse and worse. Like at first, you know, I was just, you know, one of those feminists, but then I started questioning, you know, the evangelical teaching on homosexuality, and then abortion, and then the inerrancy of scripture fell apart for me, and just on and on and on.
Mm.
So yeah. And, you know, some other thing, a big other component that pushed me towards deconstruction was a lot of ministry trauma and pain. My husband lost his job at that church where he was working as the youth pastor, and they just were just running out of money. He was the third full-time staff person that was cut. And after he was let go, they were finally able to get financially stable. But that was, you know, a huge upheaval. They were such an important community to us. We had to sell our home. We had to move in with my in-laws. I was a new mom. Like, it was just really upsetting.
Yeah.
And made for a lot of really hard transition. And then from that time until he had another full-time ministry job was 3 years.
Wow.
So like, we're having babies, we had a miscarriage, I'm working part-time jobs, he's working part-time jobs. He is searching for pastoral work every day all across America. And that was really hard.
Sounds it.
He had an interim ministry position at another church during that time that had some hurt attached to it also. And then he finally got a offer to be an associate pastor out in Phoenix, Arizona. So we moved out there. And this is 2016. This was 2 weeks before Trump was elected.
Okay. Yeah.
And which shocked me to my core because, you know, I'm a middle-class white woman. Like, I didn't think Trump was going to get elected.
I think it shocked a lot of his followers, right?
Yeah.
Even people that were ticking that in the poll booth were still, I think a lot of them were shocked. Oh, it actually happened.
Shocked. Yeah. Yes. And I just like fell apart. And, you know, the fact that 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump, I was just like, what is this madness? Like, this, like, Trump is the antithesis of Jesus. Like, what is happening here? So that accelerated my deconstruction. And then during the time we were in Phoenix was when I really started taking apart like theology, you know, like atonement theory and heaven and hell and yeah,
it does
all the pieces.
It seems really interesting to me, and I'm not surprised by it. I say frequently on the podcast, I mean, most of the audience listening to this and watching this are in America. I'm from Europe. I've lived in America for 4 years. I was in America for 2 election cycles for both of Obama's wins. So I understand some of the dynamics, and I was in a very heavy, hard, right-leaning, very pro-Republican, very kind of conflated Republican is Christian churches. So I kind of understand a lot of the dynamics going on there. But still, as a European, I'm frequently kind of like, what is happening? And it, in some ways, it doesn't surprise me at all. But in other ways, it blows my mind how much it has kickstarted people's deconstruction. Trump like exploded this for a lot of people. Like so many people sort of like, you know, just tiptoeing in the shallows going, well, maybe there's some questions. Maybe there's some stuff in my church I'm not entirely on board with. I'm not sure about that, but I do agree with most of this or that. And it feels like that was just a like tsunami that hit them while they were playing in the shallows. You know, I mean, they just like got whacked with it. And suddenly just lost almost all belief in their movement. You know, a movement that would say, well, yeah, he said, if you're rich, you can grab underage girls by their genitals and it doesn't matter. And that's fine. And it's part of the perks of being rich. But the thing is, he holds some of these Christian values that means we can ignore that, or you know, the ability to pick and choose when to be honest with you, the Christian community as a whole has not been the most graceful in that regard, generally speaking, right? They will write off a lot of politicians over like one tiny thing done
Oh,
anywhere.
absolutely.
But when
Right.
they really want someone, they'll
Hmm.
excuse almost anything.
Anything.
And that was
Anything.
very jarring for a lot of people, I think, that to see it
Yes.
just so explicitly done.
Absolutely.
Really,
Yeah.
really fascinating.
And another part of my story is that my church background and my husband's ministry background is in what I would call like soft evangelicalism.
Okay.
Like, I
Explain that to
mean,
me.
so
What would you say soft evangelicalism looks like?
just everything is a lot more subtle. Like,
Okay.
you're never going to hear anything like explicitly derogatory against like the LGBTQ community, for example. You're going
Okay.
to hear about how you should have them over for dinner and love your gay neighbors. You're never going to hear anything about how women can't lead. You're just never going to see a woman elder or pastor, but we're not going
Right.
to talk about it ever. So there's just so much that is unsaid. And that you just kind of have to absorb through osmosis when you're there. And there's sort of a like a surface level acknowledgement of like the harm the church has done and like the importance of social justice in some areas, usually like racial justice, which of course is hugely important. But that might be expressed through like tokenism, or maybe a sermon here and there when it's sort of like it would look really bad not to address it,
Right.
but not like a really deep ongoing digging in to like colonization and how have we whitewashed Jesus, and like that's not really happening in these spaces. So just everything is a lot more covert, I would say.
Sure.
And when Trump was elected and I read the statistic about the 81%, I mean, I started like furiously Googling, like, what is an evangelical? How do you know if you're an evangelical? Like, I didn't know that I was one. And it was kind of hard to figure out. And I find that a lot of evangelicals don't use that word.
Right.
Like, it's more people that are critiquing evangelicals that use that word.
Yeah.
But and I also like I had no idea that Christianity was such a big tent, because I was really only exposed to this one vein of thinking, and that was something that was really upsetting to me as I deconstructed. Like, wait a second, there's two ways to think about women, complementarian and egalitarian, and there's like 7 atonement theories. Like, you guys never mention that. I think that's a problem. I just there's also the again, not usually said explicitly, but the implication that like those Christians over there, Catholics or mainline denominations, like they're not really Christian.
Yeah.
And just without knowing any better, it was like, this is the way to be a Christian. So if you're not doing this, then you're not Christian. And I just had no idea that that's evangelicalism. That's not the whole of Christianity. So
I remember being in evangelical church, it was always painted as though those other people that were like, oh, they say they're Christian, but I'm not saying they're not going to be in heaven, but I'm not going to have the best seats, or whatever, like that kind of thing, or like, well, yeah, they're Christian, but they don't have like a real relationship or whatever, like kind of things that would be thrown around. It almost was always kind of like, it was always like kind of put out there that they were like this tiny fringe group of like 20 people that had deceived themselves. But, they're like, we'll probably let them kind of come in anyway, because they're not evil. They're not the atheists or the whatever, the new agers, but they're just misguided. And there's just a few of them who've just got a bit confused and they'll come back into the fold.
Right.
But
like almost, when you actually, look how precious they are.
Yeah. And then you take a step back and you go, holy crap, that's like a huge portion of Christianity. Like,
yes,
huge percentage of Christians are not evangelical, like the vast majority. in the
The
grand
vast
scheme of things
majority.
globally are not evangelical Christians. Evangelical
Right.
Christians are growing more than anyone else right now. But yeah, like Catholics, kind of a big movement, right? You know, that, like, you know, the mainline church is called the main line for a reason, right? It's like there's a lot of people in those movements.
Yes.
Yeah, it always fascinated me. Like, it was this kind of like, maybe if we just don't acknowledge that these are big movements, no one will ever actually look at them as though they might have something to say.
Right.
It's fascinating. It's really, because
Mm-hmm.
they have no problem. Most of these other movements have no other problem acknowledging other people having different views. They might disagree with them still, again, but they're not going to
Right.
pretend they're like some, you know, tiny movement somewhere. Like, you know,
Right.
pretty obvious about, in my experience at least, of being around people in these movements. But yeah, it always was in my evangelical kind of upbringing. It was very much like, oh yeah, but like, that's just a few people and they don't really understand Christianity, or they don't have a faith
Right.
in Jesus, or a
Right.
relationship with Jesus, or whatever that was.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued by, you know, you talk about this kind of concept of soft evangelicalism. It doesn't really talk about these issues. They kind of just expect you to kind of pick up on it. And maybe if you don't pick up on it, maybe if somehow someone who's gay comes along to church and is still gay a year in, they might like be like, all right, we really need to kind of start addressing and fixing this. But generally speaking, it's you'll pick this up on your own.
You figure it out on your own. Yeah.
Maybe if that girl in youth group is starting to go, oh, why can't I be a leader? We'll pull her aside and go, well, look at the Bible verses. Let's see why you can't be. But we're not going to have a whole series on why women can't teach.
Right. Yes.
What was their approach in politics? Because I know in the church I explicitly was involved in America. I've traveled to hundreds of churches now in America, but the church I was heavily involved in, you know, you've got all sorts of laws about what you're allowed and not allowed to do, which apparently no one gives a crap about, right? Because they all do it anyway. But there was things like they would be like, well, I'm not telling you how to vote this year. Not telling you how to vote. But I know for me that the only thing I'll vote on is abortion. And so you have two candidates there and only one of them supports abortion and one of them rejects it. So I'm not telling you how to vote. I'm not telling you what the godly way to vote is, but I know God doesn't support abortion. And like, you're like, I'm sitting there going, these guys are telling people how to vote, right? You guys acknowledge that we're being told how to vote right now, right? And everyone's like, oh no, we have to be very careful not to influence your political vote or anything. And I'm like, you are kidding, right?
Yeah.
And just the weird dynamics of that. But how do soft evangelicals engage with that political world? Is again that very subtle? Is it hopefully it's more, if they're trying to be subtle, hopefully they're more subtle than that pastor was.
Oh, much more subtle. Yeah.
Right.
And I can give them credit in this area to some extent, because in my context, there was no problem saying things like, God is not a Republican or a Democrat. There was definitely an acknowledgement that like both political parties get some things right. Like being opposed to abortion might be acknowledged as something that Republicans get right. But then they would also be willing to say, but care for the poor is something that Democrats get right. So what was really prized wasn't voting one way or the other, but almost being like above politics. Like they both have some good things about them, but they're both also broken. And, you know, the third way, our way, Jesus's way, is bigger and better than both of these. So, and this was never said, but I feel like it kind of breeds apathy.
Sure.
You know, because they both have problems. They both have good things, but they both have problems. And sort of this sense of being like above both major party platforms.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Really interesting. And it's definitely you'll hear it again and again and again, as people saying, well, Jesus wasn't political, or which you could have a big argument about that all day. I mean, you know, the guy was killed for being an insurrectionist, but but you know, like I can agree that, you know, Jesus wasn't trying to run for political office, and you know, like I get some of the dynamics of that. But yeah, it does seem a common thread in a lot of parts of Christianity, this kind of thing of like, well, yeah, like they both have something right, they both have stuff wrong, but ultimately neither represent God, neither are building God's kingdom. And so we should build God's
Exactly.
kingdom and let that, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's. We're over here, God's people. Let
Yes.
Caesar play over there.
Mm-hmm.
Which again, I kind of understand. I understand some of the anachronistic kind of like concepts in that as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be said for some of those kind of beliefs. Like I get it as well. I felt it as well. But it can be very damaging as well. Voter apathy is a very problematic element as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. Very interesting. And so
Mm-hmm.
you are, I'm trying to kind of backtrack because we just dove into that big time, but I was just really
Yeah.
interested. So, this movement of kind of soft evangelicalism, this is where you're deconstructing, you're figuring yourself out. Your husband's, gone from like having a secure job to not, to maybe having some interim stuff. And he's
Mm-hmm.
finally got another position in Phoenix.
Yes.
Trump gets elected. You're going, what is happening? Is this really my tradition?
Uh-huh.
Is that what we believe?
Right.
Is that what we
Right.
support?
Mm-hmm.
Um, what was it? What was it that was going on there that caused you to be so concerned about that? Because I know a lot of people have lots to say about Trump that are positive and negative, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure that you can say lots about him that are positive and negative.
Right.
Again, I have my own opinions on that. I'm not going to overly get into that. But what was it to you that, because it was quite early on as well, right? We didn't have 4 years of Trump's
Mm-hmm.
office action. His action in office
Yeah.
is his politics, where we just had this kind of like campaign and maybe his history on TV and the newspapers, whatever else he was famous for, and
Mm-hmm.
on Home
Mm-hmm.
Alone or whatever. What what was it at that point that you were, because I mean this was a big thing, right? I remember I was in America when he was inaugurated and the women's marches were going on and things like that.
Yeah.
You were not alone in having an extremely adverse kind of like effect to
Mm-hmm.
Trump winning,
Yeah.
and that causing you to question a lot about your country, your faith, your
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But what were some of those things that you say, like, he's the antithesis, he's the opposite of Jesus in so many ways?
Right.
What was
Yeah.
that for you?
It was a lot of things that happened during the time he was running, like when he said that Mexicans were rapists. Well, he mocked that reporter who I can't recall specifically, but the reporter had some sort of disability.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
And he mocked this person at a rally, for laughs. I mean, the huge one for me was the Access Hollywood tape, when he said, grab them by the pussy. When you're famous, they let you do it, that whole thing. And then, when he got elected, I mean, I had the same nightmare 3 weeks in a row, which was Trump, the sexual perpetrator, like coming into my house and assaulting me in the middle of the night.
Wow.
And I had that nightmare every night for 3 weeks.
Wow.
Like, to me, it was clear that he was a very bad, dangerous man. Also, perhaps, mentally ill and needing help, but definitely not someone who should be leading the country.
Yeah.
And I think my own just personal kind of like feeling of displacement at that time just added to it, because I was already in a vulnerable place. Like, we had just moved across the country. And honestly, I knew when we visited this church, because, when you're interviewing for a pastoral job, there's rounds of interviews and then they want to fly you out to visit for a weekend. And of course you bring your wife with you because it's a package deal, right? That whole thing. And so we had visited this church in June, and I knew intuitively that it was not a good fit. But I just didn't have the heart to not let it happen. We had visited a different church way out in Sequim, Washington, which is like, the far corner of the Pacific Northwest.
Sure.
A few months earlier. And I really didn't like that church. And I was like, no way, I'm not going here. It's in the middle of nowhere. The pastor is,
That's
so
funny.
fake. Like, we're not going there. And by the time, this Phoenix opportunity comes around, it had been 3 years.
Yeah.
3
It's really
years.
tough.
And just practically, we needed money. We had 2 little kids. It was really hard.
Yeah.
And, they wanted to give him a job, and he wanted a job and he needed a job. And I wanted him to be happy, and I hoped that I was wrong. Unfortunately, I wasn't.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're there, and I think I know on some level that this isn't going to go well. And my mom had just left. Like, she helped us move, and then she left a few days before the election. And I'm alone in this new place with these little kids, and in a church full of Trumpers. And I was just lonely and terrified. And then, so that church was more like your traditional evangelical, like a lot more outspoken about politics. And of course you're supposed to be a Republican, and yay, we're so excited about President Trump. And that dynamic was alive and well there. And so that was tough.
How did your husband's kind of navigate a lot of this? Because
yeah,
by the sounds of it, he's not deconstructing right now, right?
Right.
Is that safe to say, or is he, and are you talking about a lot of these questions you have with him, or are you thinking that this is not going to be good for him at all, and where he's at?
Well, yeah. So it's been quite a journey, and to be honest, it's been the hardest part of my deconstruction, really by far. Earlier on in my process, like when I started questioning women and what the Bible says about women, we used to have fights about that. I'd be like, well, what about Junia, like she was an apostle? And he'd be like, well, what about the 12 were all men? Like, doesn't that mean something? And we'd have these fights about hermeneutics. And and my husband has a very different upbringing than I do. He was raised in the conservative church his whole life. And then went to seminary and devoted his life to ministry. So we just super different life experiences leading up to the beginning of our life together. So when I'm, we would talk about homosexuality some. I remember when I confessed that I no longer thought the Bible was inerrant, and because I felt like I was lying to him, and I had to get it off my chest. And he was really kind about it. I don't think he realized at the time that I was kind of as far down this deconstructing path as I was. And as that became more apparent, we started to clash more. And I did try to just start hiding things, if I was listening to a deconstruction podcast, if I had been listening to your show and he walked in the room, I would have paused it, not telling him the books I was reading. And that was really hard. And I felt guilty. And I also just felt like this is not going to go well. I was scared of being rejected. So that was really, really tough. And you can't just make someone think the same things that you think. This is such a personal journey, and it doesn't look the same for everyone. And 10 years ago, Halley would be horrified at who I am today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's the same as your mom when you came home from school going, I became a Christian. Did you know Jesus has saved us? Your mom can't go, all right, let's sit down and let's crush this at the helm. She was never going to stop you believing in Jesus, right? You were in. It's something you can only get to a tipping point where maybe then if you're at that right moment, something can push you over the edge.
But
and you probably know him better than any person on the planet, right? You probably know more than anyone, this is not the moment. He's not going to come in and see me reading whatever, I don't know, a Brian McLaren book or, whatever else, Sarah Bessie. He's not going to look under my pillow and find Sarah Bessie and go, wow, I just read the blurb and I'm totally changed. Probably not, and that's a tough thing to live with. We talked to lots of people that are in that.
There was so much at stake for him. I mean, for me too, but I mean, he is a pastor, like
that's his training, that's his education, it's how he makes his living,
right. It's just his whole life. So that was really tough. And then also like our experience at the Arizona church just became like more and more toxic. And he worked there for a year and a half until eventually he was fired. And the senior pastor, I'm sorry to say, is really an abusive narcissist. And we found out that the way that my husband was let go was very similar to what had happened to people before him. And we've also found out that it's happened to people since him. And it was all like very deceitful. Like we were manipulated and told that, if we went along with this, that they would take care of our family. And I was a stay-at-home mom at the time. Like this was our only source of income. And, so we did, and we felt like we had no other options. And also just when it's happening to you in like real time, you're just like, what is this a dream? Like what is going on? Like you can't even really like fully, you can't process it while you're experiencing it. And, so they made up this huge lie about how we wanted to be full-time church planters, which wasn't true. We had planted a church as part of his duties with this church, and that was okay in theory. He wasn't happy there either, my husband, and he saw the church plant as, a possible way out. Like he could plant this church and have it the way he wanted. And then, he wouldn't have relocated our family for nothing. And like we could still make this Arizona thing work. But the church plant became really difficult. I never wanted to plant a church, but I was expected to be part of it because that's evangelical marriage. That's evangelical ministry. Like,
free second worker.
Yeah. And sort of in my the soft evangelical background that we had, there would be people were happy to say things like, to sort of condemn that, like, you're not expected to be a second worker, and we know you're not on the payroll and stuff like that. But it wasn't enough because which became very clear to me through this church planting experience, because I'm deconstructing and I'm getting further and further and further away from evangelicalism. So my husband's vision was not a vision that I shared. And that was like really painful. And I didn't want to like come out and say that because it's hurtful, but it was also the truth. And, and he really wanted to get out of this toxic church that we were in. And I did too, but this just wasn't the way to do it. We had another baby while we were in Arizona. So we started this church plant when our youngest was a month old. It was just like a lot that was going on at the same time. And so we had started this church plant as a, this is part of your job as the associate pastor. We want to plant a church can you cut that?
Let me write down the time and I'll try and cut it down. Yeah, you're fine.
Because I just we never signed any kind of like non-disclosure statement.
That's fine.
but I just don't want to like say specifics.
That's fine.
For my own
So you
protection.
planted this church.
We just planted this church in this nearby area. So when they wanted to get rid of him, they just used that as a vehicle that they could spin for their advantage. Like we were already doing it. And then the lie became, well, they wanted, they feel called by God to do this full time.
Yeah.
The word calling has just become really like triggering for me because it's just been used against us.
Yeah.
So they tell the whole congregation this, and we have to go along with it because of the hush money that we needed to survive. And I never went back to the church after that. My husband knows me well enough. He knows that I would just be like weeping or like just like flicking people off everywhere. But he had to do like another 5 Sundays or something before his last day. And, he had to deal with people saying things like, oh, won't you stay? We love you so much. Why won't you stay? And, and because of the way that the presbytery works in this denomination, the group of elders can't just come out and fire somebody.
Yeah.
The entire congregation has to dissolve the call.
Okay. Wow.
So
it's got to be quite congregational, democratic voting kind of.
Yes. So the leadership manipulated the congregation, deceived them to make this happen.
Yeah. Well, you don't need to, it's easier to vote on, yes, we think if they're called to do that, we support it, rather than, you're firing these people? Like,
right.
Do we like?
Right.
Wow. It's tough. I've seen that used so many times. I talk to hundreds of people, and they'll share their stories and things like that. But the amount of people that have, in the process of leaving church, been, given a goodbye time, or just kind of never acknowledged, and like they just leave, and they're just like, well, we'll just, we'll say they were called to this, or that they this or whatever. But a lot of times, even like they'll have a goodbye thing, and they'll say, oh, we're having a celebration, we're saying goodbye to this person, and the person's like, I just like gave you a list of all these reasons I'm leaving the church, and it's because I've been hurt, I've been abused, I had this traumatic experience, I fundamentally disagree with you, and you're like kind of thrusting upon me, calling me up on the stage. I'm now in a state of like, oh crap, what do? I don't want to be a bad guy, but I have no time to prepare for this at all. And so there's this smiling, the nodding, you get some flowers or like a little like, gift or, whatever. And they're, we're sending you off to whatever you're doing next, and, and it just feels like there's this, it's amazing to see when you look at the numbers of people leaving the church, not happy with the church they're leaving, or not content with the way that operates, or seeing it very differently is huge. But when you're in a church day in, day out, you can see those people leaving, but there's never any of this kind of aftermath. There's never any of the blow-ups. You never hear about it. It's always done so carefully, so tidily, and it does. You're not the first person I've heard of. People are probably really shocked to be like, "Wait, what? They offered you money to not say anything and like to, I'm like, people are shocked, but I'm not. I think I'm disgusted by it, and I'm annoyed by it, and but I'm not shocked. I'm like, nope, yep, I've heard that story so many times. And it's just it's astonishing to me the dynamics in play here to keep up an appearance that we are perfect, everything is right, that everything out there is somehow wrong.
Well, no one wants to know how the bacon is made. They want to eat the bacon, but they don't want to see how you make it. And when you are involved with ministry, like you see the good, the bad, and the really, really ugly. Like, this church spent $500,000 on a new organ. The organ they had worked fine, but it wasn't the best. And my husband was the only dissenting vote on that. And everyone else was like, yeah, this seems like a great thing to do with $500,000. And, just stuff like that. Like they spent $20,000 on the church's 50th year anniversary party. It wasn't even a good party. Um, just like,
You could have
do
thrown a
you guys
slightly better
see?
one for 20 grand, you reckon?
Yeah. But
Dang.
I'm like, do you see the homeless people on the streets of
Just
Phoenix? Like,
unbelievable.
right? Like,
Yeah.
what are we doing? This is not the way of Jesus. This is not how people should behave who claim to have been changed by the gospel. Like, this is not right. This is not okay.
Mm.
And then, you add to it just the way that people are mistreated. There's a lot of talk, like in our kind of ex-evangelical space on Instagram,
Mhm.
about the toxicity of pastors, which is very true. It needs to be talked about. But, another part of the conversation is that pastors eat their young. When you're a youth
Mhm.
pastor or an associate pastor and you're not, the big dog at the bowl, you are, it's a ripe situation for abuse.
Yeah.
And there's supposed to be a recourse for that. Like, you're supposed to be able to report something to the presbytery, and they, in theory, are like, can operate as essentially a court system. But almost always they back senior pastors. And if
Mm.
if you're not the one who has the most power, like, it's not going to go well for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's wild. I remember being a part of a movement where, I mean, the senior pastors would teach, and it was a big movement, so there was senior pastors, right? So I mean, like, multiple senior pastors.
Yeah.
But there was still like the executive senior or whatever that works, right? But like it was this culture of we respect and we honor those that are leading us and doing so much. And you know what? I think it's really easy to shit all over pastors. It really is, because there's a lot of
Mhm.
pastors out there that are just the worst. They're just the pits.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I was a pastor's kid and different in the UK, and I know lots of pastors. I talk to pastors every day on Instagram. They're talking to me about
Yeah.
their process of trying to de-stress. And a
Mhm.
huge portion of pastors out there get paid nothing, or
Yep.
scraping by, or
Yep.
spending their days in hospitals, sitting by
Mhm.
kids that have just had an abortion, supporting them through that painful process. They're
Right.
doing good work day in, day out, and not very
Yeah.
thanked for it, and they don't have the
Right.
support and the whatever. So
Right.
I think there's two very different types of pastors, and I don't want to conflate
Mhm.
them across the board. But they kind of like looked on that model of like, look at all these pastors, they don't get the respect they deserve, they don't get like
Yeah.
honor, and they're doing a hard work, and they are doing a hard work, most of them. I think that
Mhm.
possibly changes when you support, your pastoral team is 30 people or something. It's probably a bit different.
Right.
But in this environment, they were doing things like, oh well, to honor people, you should take Saturday off, and you should go and do the senior leader's garden, and there'd be a team of like 5 or 6 volunteers that would go around and do his garden. First of all,
Mm.
having if 5 or 6 people need to do your garden once a week,
Right.
you've got a big enough garden that you can probably afford some help. Right?
Yeah.
You don't need to be right. If you've got a garden that big, I'd wager you can afford some gardeners.
Uh-huh.
But there's just these dynamics of like, there was someone that would wash, and it was often, it was shown by like it was the leaders in the church that would head up these teams,
Oh,
and
yeah.
so there was
Mhm.
a leader that would head up, and they would go around and wash the senior leaders' cars once a week.
Oh, yeah.
One of the
Yeah.
leader paid staff,
Yeah.
and yet in their spare time when they weren't getting paid, however you
Mhm.
break that up, and I know you've been involved in church, that's a misnomer anyway, right? You're
Mhm.
constantly on.
Mhm.
um
Mhm.
but they're washing senior leaders' cars, and it's this
Yeah.
weird privilege and title, the
Yeah.
opportunity for abuse. You look at the data on narcissism as it's represented amongst leaders within churches and
Yeah.
religions compared to the general populace. It's through
Mm.
the roof. I don't remember the
Through the
numbers,
roof.
but it's
Yeah.
massive. It
Yes.
attracts narcissists.
Absolutely.
um and that's a really dangerous thing. And the thing is as well, it's not just sometimes I think it's dangerous to solely blame pastors, because I think the structure makes those
Yes.
pastors.
Oh, for
We make
sure.
that pastor by expecting them to be
Yes.
perfect, expecting them to, be on this
Yeah.
pedestal, to do the whatever. And
Yeah.
it's a really, really messy environment.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I
Yes.
don't,
I
I
mean,
feel for people stuck in it, like, that you were
uh-huh.
just stuck in this dynamic big time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, And I do think senior pastors are, I mean, lauded just beyond belief, and distinctly more so than like associates, assistants, and
Mm,
youth pastors. I mean, the senior pastor at this Arizona church, I mean, he made almost, I don't know exactly what his salary was, but I believe it was like 80 grand more a year than my husband was.
mm,
Like a lot more.
yeah.
Um, and he could really do no wrong. And, you know, so of course narcissists are going to be attracted to being pastors, because you can have total control. You can have, you know, you can just have your narcissism on steroids,
Right.
and no one's going to question you because you're the pastor.
Mhm.
And it just creates too much cognitive dissonance for people. They don't want to go there.
Right.
Um, and when my husband was fired, we found out sometime later that the leadership of that church told the congregation that we didn't want to be contacted, which is not true.
It's really common.
So
I've
then
heard that a
everyone,
lot.
you know, just never reached out to us because they were told that we didn't want them to.
It's so messed
Um,
up.
yeah. So, you know, just silencing people, excommunicating them,
Mhm.
separating them from their
But you have to
community.
do that on some level, because you
Mhm.
can't risk your side of the story infiltrating the perfectly kept,
Oh,
environment.
well, right.
It would ruin
Right.
everything if people found out, oh wait, you didn't particularly want to leave.
Right.
Well, maybe it was a silver lining situation anyway, but you didn't want to leave, you didn't choose to this, you're not excited about
Right.
going off and planting a church.
Right.
Oh, whoa, that's
Yeah.
different. What's going on here?
Right.
You
Yes.
can't
Oh,
create
yeah.
that environment.
Right. The
Yeah.
institution must be protected above all.
Yeah. So now
Yeah.
you guys make that transition, and
Mhm.
it's only then that you said that you started to feel a bit more free about, speaking about stuff, being more public about that. Is that
Yeah.
right?
So we continued, or it's hard to know if I should say we or he, my husband, continued with the church plant for a few months after we were no longer part of the big church. Um, it was it led to a really, really dicey season in our relationship, um, because I was super traumatized by what happened at the church he had been employed by, and he was too. But you know, pastoring was so deeply tied to his identity,
Yeah.
and you know, he wanted to be able to make this church plant work. And I was like, the church plant is so tied for me to the mother church, and I can't separate them. And also, I just didn't want to plant a church. Like, you know, like they talk about it even within evangelicalism as like, you know, a call, or like something that you have to really want to do because it's a
Yeah.
hard thing to do.
It's
And I
hard.
and I just didn't want to. And I wanted to want to for his sake, but I just didn't. And that never happened. You know,
Mm.
that never changed for me. Um, so it was real messy. Like I was trying to tell him I don't want to do this, and he was trying to, you know, mold the church plant in such a way that I would like it more and that it would be more aligned with my desires. But we were just in like such different places.
Mm.
um at one point he asked me if I was a universalist, and I said yes because that's the truth. And that was like really, really upsetting for
Mm.
him, really terrifying for him. um and eventually, so he got fired in May, and we stopped the church plant in October,
Okay.
when I was just finally like, I've been trying to tell you I don't want to do this, and like that's just the truth. I don't want to do this. Um, and not beat around the bush about it. Um, it was just a really, really hard thing to be honest about.
Yeah. I bet.
And also just a really hard thing for him to hear, even when I was more direct. So it was a struggle. But eventually, you know, the church plant ended because of that. And I was trying to advocate to him, like, I don't want to plant a church. but you do. So just go plant one. Like, why do I have to be a part of it? And that was really painful for him. And I knew he wanted my support and he wanted me to be part of it, but I was frustrated by this idea that I mean, it's the pastor's wife thing, that I have to be like absorbed into his identity just by default, even if I don't align with the vision, or if I have a different passion, or if I want to do something else with my time. Like, evangelicalism doesn't accept that. So we just went through a really, really rough patch where he was very upset with me. And I was like, hey, I'm the one defending you. Like, the church was so horrible to you. And like, you should be mad at them, not mad at me. And we just were like super not on the same page and just really missing each other. And, thanks to therapy, it got better. Yeah. And we're in a much better place now. So that was 2018. So now he's working in a different field, and he's more curious about he's more spiritually curious about my journey. And I think his own. We're reading a Brad Jersak book together. Like, he's reading it right now, and then I'm going to read it and we're going to talk about it. And that seems to be like a place that we can meet, like maybe like a little more progressive than he would prefer, and a little more conservative than I am.
Sure.
And it feels like
we're a conversation for you, and that's great.
Like we're kind of like knitting something back together. So we stayed in Arizona for about a year after the whole thing fell apart. And then we moved back to St. Louis, which is where we're both from. And we've been here since last summer. And we haven't been going to church. It's really important to my husband that we do go to church. And I have that desire too. But it's for, the last couple of years, it's just become more and more obvious, like, how could we possibly find a church that we both like? But I think we both feel committed to that, even though we're kind of like, this is going to look a lot different than we thought it was going to.
Sure. So what kind of churches are you exploring and looking at in that process? Like, because I imagine something that's kind of like very like progressive, like I don't know, whatever like the progressive church kind of banner would look like would be way off the deep end and too scary for where he's at. And yet you veer too close to evangelical kind of territory. Like, you probably feel a bit more comfortable, and you would be like, like get back.
Right. Well, exactly. That's been the struggle, and he has, considered going to church by himself. But he doesn't really want to. And I realized, like, I don't really want him to either. Like, I don't have any problem with that concept, because I've been, advocating for the idea that like spouses are different people and they might want different things. But the truth is that like a spiritual connection with my spouse is something that I want. And like, I like it when we talk about theology and faith. I mean, I like it when we talk and it doesn't turn into a big fight, which is what we're able to do now. So yeah, like I just want us to be able to engage faith together. But it's way, way, way different than it was, when we got married and we were on the same page about everything, which is what we were taught as evangelicals. You have to do, like, got to be equally yoked,
That's just unspoken, right? You have to believe the same thing. You have to be equally yoked. When you get married, like, there's no possibility that this other person would ever not love Jesus at some point in their life, or not love Jesus the way I do, or not church the way I do, or like, it's just not even part of the thought process, right? we say vows about like, being faithful to one another before we even think about going, well, and I promise to always believe in God, or, but that's just not even on the page. Like, of
It's not
course,
even on the page. Yeah.
and it is so interwoven. It's even things like going to church and things like it feels like, in a lot of Christianity, um, one's spiritual path is very intermingled with one's family. Like there isn't much room for a family to be in a different place. There isn't much,
Right.
if you see it all the time, because there's that gender gap where more women are in the church than men. Women go to the
Mm-hmm.
church and everyone is, where's your husband? Is he okay? Does he not believe?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
all about
Mm-hmm.
where's your husband? What's he doing? Where's his faith? Why?
Yes.
It's all centered around these concepts of like a
Right.
unified,
Mm-hmm.
healthy family as we see it.
Yes. As we see it.
Um,
Right.
even if the
Oh, yeah.
husband
There's
was
a
at a
ton
different
of
church, it
shame.
would be an issue.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I look back on our past churches and I think about the people who were married, but their spouse didn't come to church. There was a
Mhm.
lot of shame surrounding that.
Yeah,
Like you didn't like come out and say anything, but it was kind of like, what's happening there? Like
yeah.
that's so weird. Um, so
It's
yeah.
those unspoken models. It's the same, we do it with, people that are coming to church on their own without their family. We go, oh, we're not gonna say anything, but also, well, she's obviously not invited to the, this group which is full of couples, or
Oh,
whatever.
right,
What
right,
about the couple that don't have kids, whether they can or they don't want to? That's a
right.
problem, right? What are we
Hmm.
always asking them? So when are you gonna have kids, right? And or what
Right.
about the couple that are engaged or not
Yeah.
engaged? Or when are you getting engaged? When are you getting married? It's just this consistent,
Right.
like we have these ideals of what a healthy life looks like, and so much of it is conflated around these kind of family ideals,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
and it
Yeah.
seems to drive our questioning our desires for other people's lives, right? I mean, this isn't got anything to do with me, right? This is like
Right.
Julie that comes to church and I see her once a week. I don't
Uh-huh.
really have any, it doesn't impact me whatsoever whether she brings her husband or
Whatsoever.
whether she gets married or
Mhm.
whether she has kids, or none of that's
Yep.
actually particularly relevant to my day in, day out.
Right.
But I somehow
Right.
care because she's a Christian and
Yeah.
she could be this and this.
Right. Well, the nuclear family is really worshipped
Mm,
inside, you know, evangelical church culture, which plays into patriarchy and homophobia and these other toxic systems that are
mm,
alive and well. Um, but yeah, the idea that someone can even deconstruct or deconvert or even just change in any significant way what they believe, like, is just not on the table.
no.
I mean, it never entered my consciousness of why, when I was a younger Christian. um and it's wild. I mean, I still identify as a Christian. I mean, I also identify as an agnostic and maybe something of a mystic, but I still identify as a Christian. Like, the story of Jesus is still really important to me, but I get DMs from people about how I have to get saved and how I'm so lost
Mm,
and how I don't know Jesus. And I'm like, you don't even know what you're talking about.
yeah.
Like, and I think that's a misconception that the church has about people who deconstruct, that it's a process of losing faith. And it is. And for some people, it they lose their faith completely and they don't want to have a faith anymore, and that's fine.
Mm,
But I think it's also a process of faith becoming truer and deeper and more meaningful.
yeah.
But there is just no tolerance for that narrative. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, for a lot of people, it's the process of trying to grow in their faith,
Hmm.
whatever that looks
Oh,
like,
yeah.
in their paradigm of what it looks like to be connected to God, to
Right.
know,
Yeah.
or to be spiritual and to be a better person. Like they're
Right.
pursuing these journeys of, I want to be a more whole person. I want to be more connected to God. I want to have
Right.
a better relationship with God. That was generally
Hmm.
speaking the starting point for deconstruction. It's well, I want to know, like, what can this look like? That doesn't look
Oh,
like a healthy thing, and I
absolutely.
want to be more healthy. I want to be more Christ-like, or whatever it
Yes.
is, right?
Yeah.
And so it's such and of course it's got to be this, because otherwise people have huge existential crises and they, whole world collapses. But
Right.
it is such a bizarre thing at the same time that there's this need to either label what you're going through as something it's not, that makes me feel more comfortable, or dismiss what you had initially. So it's like, oh,
Yes.
you were never really saved. Let me save you. Let
Right.
me
You
show
were
you
never
what real
actually a
Christianity
Christian.
was.
Clearly.
No.
Yeah.
It's like, are you
Right.
kidding? I was the pastor's wife. I knew.
Right.
Like, I got saved. I got saved as a teenager.
Do you
Been
want to
living
see
this
my
for like,
Bible? It's
a
marked up
while.
like crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
fascinating, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I wanted to talk to you about, because when I first started following you, when I posted some initial outcomes of some of our research that we've been doing about,
Mm-hmm.
one of the findings that we found was that plenty of people at Deconstruct still attend church. Now, I don't know what that looks like yet, whether it's they move and find something like you and your husband are trying to do, find something that's a bit more suitable for them, or whether
Yeah.
they are stuck in a church like maybe you were with your husband at one point.
Right.
So different arguments for why that might be, or maybe they just go, I'm cool with this, whatever.
Yeah.
But one of the things that was like a subcategory within that was that it was found that women were twice as likely to not stay in the church. Double negative. No, no, it wasn't double negative. But men would generally speaking hang around the church more while they were deconstructing than women. And
Yeah.
you shared some interesting thoughts on that, and you highlighted a kind of series that you had. And I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about what you think about that, because I have hypotheses for days on that, and I don't have the data. No one's done a study on that yet, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I thought some of your thoughts on that were really interesting. And as a woman, I've not deconstructed as a woman in the church, and so I'm intrigued to maybe flesh out some of those ideas with you, because I think it'll be really interesting to talk about.
Yeah, well, I think there's probably multiple reasons, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is that male privilege is a very big thing in church. And, in every other category other than being a woman, I'm privileged. I'm white, I'm straight, cisgender, American. So having a uterus is my only, oppressed identity. But in the evangelical church, that oppression is real.
It's a pretty big one, that one.
It's big. It's huge. So, women just experience things in the conservative church that men don't. And, as much as I disagree with Christian fundamentalism, I have like a weird kernel of respect, at least for the churches who just come out and say what they believe. Like, yep, we think that women should be subordinate to men, and they're not as close to God, and they were deceived first and can't be pastors, and they're under the umbrella and the whole God husband wife thing. You ever seen the umbrella?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like they just come out and say it. And that was never my experience. And I think a lot of women experience gaslighting in the church. And I think this is honestly often unintentional, but it doesn't mean that it's not impactful, right?
Sure.
I don't think that most male pastors are evil. I think that they are a product of the system, kind of how we mentioned before, and they only know what they know. And one of the things that they don't know is what it's like to be in a female body and have an authority figure tell you that you're supposed to be quiet, you're not allowed to teach men, and that God says so. And I think that, another stat about women that you mentioned earlier was that women attend church more than men. Yeah. So deconstructed women are leaving twice as much as men, but inside the church, there are more women who go to church than men. And I think Christian women are just really faithful. And not that Christian men aren't, but I don't know. Christian women show up and take care of the babies and make the food, and our deacons, if they're allowed, they do a lot of labor for the church, I think, out of their genuine love for Jesus. And I think the church exploits that.
Mm.
Again, probably unintentionally, but when that happens to you over and over and over again, and you serve and you serve and you serve, but you're never going to be an elder.
Yeah.
You're never going to be nominated for an elder. You're not even going to think about like going to seminary, even if you really feel a call to ministry or a desire for that, because you can't. I mean, you could technically, but you're not going to be able to get ordained. You're not going to be able to preach because, I mean, like I remember hearing about a woman pastor when I was still very evangelical, and like the immediate first thought is like, oh, that's sinful, you know?
Yeah.
And like dismissing her as, you know, not a real Christian or not faithful to scripture. She doesn't have a high view of the Bible, etc.
What kind of terrible church would let that happen? You know, like
right.
they couldn't find one man that was available, you know?
Right. So when you're an evangelical woman who loves Jesus and believes the Bible is inerrant, you give up so much. You give up part of yourself. You give up autonomy. You give up having a voice. And you do all of this willingly because you have been told that it's the price of following Jesus, and you will do anything to follow Jesus because it matters to you that much.
Yeah.
And that just takes a toll on you.
Yeah.
It really takes a toll. So, you know, pastors and elders, all men, of course, might affirm these things in you as a woman, but they're never gonna give you a platform. They're never going to consider that you like deserve a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And I have a local group of deconstructed folks that I get together with here in St. Louis.
Awesome.
And it's exclusively women, and that wasn't by design, and men are welcome to attend. But I mean, to your point, I just keep finding women, and most of our stories start with our own hurt as women in the church.
Yeah.
I was talking to a couple of our Instagram friends the other day about how when you deconstruct, first you see the hurt that was done to you, and then you see how you've hurt other people.
Yeah.
And that was very true for me, you know, kind of this like feminist awakening in me and being like, wait a second, this isn't okay. And I have a daughter now, and no way in hell are you going to tell her that she can't be a pastor if she wants to. And then, you know, when I let myself feel the hurt connected to that, then I was able to start unpacking like my racism and my homophobia and my, you know, all the privilege that I have in these other areas and ways that I had unconsciously, you know, done harm to other people by being in this system. So, yeah, I think women have a unique or just a different hurt than men do. And at least in my context, it's unacknowledged. So like, I remember being at church once a couple years ago, and we were in Arizona, but we were visiting St. Louis. And I attended the church that we had been part of, you know, years back, where my husband was the youth pastor. And they were ordaining new elders that day. And of course they were men, and all the other elders were up on stage, also all men, and the pastor, who's also a man. And no one says anything about that ever. And, and, you know, I'm just sitting there along with half the church who are also women, and who knows how it's hitting other women, but the way it hit me was, you know, I am a second-class citizen here.
Yeah.
And I am so angry about that. But if I knew that if I was to like say something to the pastor, my former pastor, and and if any, I think every evangelical woman knows this, or ex-evangelical woman, like, especially if it's in a context like mine, where everything is said very, very nicely, but the things that are being said are not nice in and of themselves.
Yeah.
So, if you go up to the pastor and you like express, probably with emotion because it's hurtful, that this is not okay, and like, how dare you, and you're going to be met with, oh my gosh, what's wrong? What are you talking about? We love women here. Like, and I know for me, for years, I never I never actually like went up to my pastor and yelled at him about how wrong I thought his theology was. Except for my husband. He's the only pastor I've done that to.
Yeah.
But so I never actually did that, but I still like would hear those comments.
Mm-hmm.
They're inserted in different ways in sermons or in church emails, or just, you just pick it up,
Yeah.
like, and you start to feel crazy. And this is the gaslighting I'm talking about. Like,
Yeah.
oh gosh, yeah, like, wow, you're being really nice, and I guess my bad, like, and you kind of walk away like, what just happened? And I think it's kind of hard to see until you see it.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, oh, you can't unsee it.
Yeah. I often wonder, so again, not a woman, so my whole perspective is so warped, but I guess I see it from the other perspective, where I get one extra privilege, right? I have a whole bunch of privileges and I get one more.
Yep.
And so I see it from that side. But I, in the churches I've been a part of, as I've deconstructed, I have always been entertained in that process.
Yeah.
And in my experience, when other very close friends that are female, I have probably more female friends than male friends, so I've been exposed to a lot of what their deconstruction looks like.
Sure.
And of course I talk to men and women all day about this, so I
Yeah.
kind of got a bit of a picture over all of that. But generally speaking, women aren't entertained. So a woman comes to a pastor and goes, look, I'm questioning this, I'm asking this, I'm wondering this, and it seems, again, very anecdotal. I've not sat down with loads of data here. I don't know if anyone's able to collect the data on that one. But it seems that it's dismissed. It's maybe like, oh, you're just being emotional about it. You'll settle down and it'll make sense. Or, oh, well,
Yeah.
well, women aren't supposed to be thinking about it. You go ask your husband, or any
Oh,
number
yeah.
of variety of different answers. But
Uh-huh.
when I go to the pastor and go, hey, I'm thinking about this, I'm not sure, and they're like, well, let's get coffee and we could sit down with the Bible and we can discuss it, and maybe we could read a book each about it. We could recommend a book to each other about our perspective, and we could talk. And not every
Yes.
pastor is willing to do that either. But but
Sure.
there's this totally different. There's just a different personality afforded to a man versus a woman. A man is allowed to ask questions. A man is allowed to, forge his own path and to be his own self. And asking questions is a good thing for a man. He should be out there doing the thinking and the hard
You're
work.
curious about the Bible. Yeah.
And that's
Good for
wonderful.
you.
You're reading the Bible
Right.
to question and to explore and to, grow.
Yeah.
But it's almost the woman should be reading the Bible to be the dutiful servant that's praying and fasting at home, that's that's maybe teaching the kids or something. But you're reading the Bible so you can be a better wife, so you can be a better mom, but not so
Right.
I actually, figure out some of what the hell this spiritual world is. It just feels like there's a very different opportunity for men who are deconstructing in the church than there is for women who are deconstructing. I would feel much safer saying, I've been questioning stuff recently, but I know a lot of my female friends have gone, I can't say that. Like, that's not going to go well for me.
Well, no. And like you mentioned that the pastor might say, hey, let's go have coffee. And that's male privilege right there. No male pastor, at least in evangelicalism, is going to offer that to a woman.
Right.
It's, it's the Billy Graham rule. You can't do that.
Well, you might wow him with your wily ways.
Right.
Gosh.
You can't have coffee with a temptress, So that is not even, like, women don't get that access to their pastor. So you only get, church on Sunday morning and like public events. Like, you don't get to like pick your pastor's brain over coffee.
Sure.
You just don't get to. It's not an option if you're a woman. And I think, I mean, no woman who's deconstructing doesn't know that.
Yeah.
So that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
And you mentioned showing emotion, and I think that absolutely is a big part of it. And you know, we think that women are more emotional than men, which I don't think is true.
No
But
male pastor has ever shown emotion when, you know, someone's brought
Never.
scratching or anything, you know?
Right. But we associate emotion with femininity.
Yeah.
So if you cry as a woman because you are so disappointed or enraged or in grief or confused or all of it, like, you are so easily dismissed because evangelicalism is all about you know, it's a product of the Enlightenment. You know, you have to have a reason for what you believe, and everything is supposed to be rational. And
it's odd as well, because emotions themselves are rational, are logical. Most of the time when someone shows an emotion, if they're crying, if they're angry, if they're happy, you could sit down and go, why are they feeling that? Let's look at what's happened in their day or what conversation. Oh, that's a rational thing based on this rational, like, it's weird to me that it's a reason to even dismiss something. It's a very surprising thing that we say, that we get away with, that like no one goes, why does someone having emotions mean that their point is invalid? It's like that doesn't seem to make any sense.
Right. But it's baked into, you know, the theology. You know, your heart is deceitful, lean not on your own understanding. I mean, it was subtle, at least in my context, but you definitely get the message that, like, you're not supposed to trust your emotions.
Yeah.
So then when you express any, it's like, well, you're breaking the rules and you're clearly not being rational, because you can't be emotional and rational at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is a crock of shit, but that's the message. And I think toxic masculinity is really strongly aligned with toxic religion. They're both about being right and being powerful. So, like, to express, so that series that I did that you mentioned, you know, I had this idea that I'm gonna have to move where I'm sitting, so plug in this computer.
Oh, you're fine. No worries.
I had this thought that we have to somewhat deconstruct masculine or toxic masculinity in order to start deconstructing evangelicalism. And what I meant by that was that to start deconstructing, you have to let in things like empathy, uncertainty, curiosity, vulnerability. These are all traits that are associated more with being feminine than being masculine. And they're a threat to evangelical theology and church hierarchy. So, you know, I think that everyone has what society calls masculine and feminine traits about them.
Sure.
But, you know, because of the culture that we're raised in, you know, at least in the West, like, women tend to have those things in greater abundance.
Sure. Or men are taught to suppress them or hide them.
They're taught to suppress them.
Yeah.
Right. So women are taught to have those things, but we're also taught that we're going to be thought lesser because of them at the same time. You know, like, if you go up to your pastor and you start crying, like, you know, like we were just saying, like, it's not going to go well for you. You have to kind of play it, quote, like a man to be taken seriously at all.
Sure.
So, you know, I don't think like the quote war on women is really about women as much as it's about femininity.
Mm,
Um, and we have to crush femininity wherever it exists, whether it's in women or in gay men that the church deems as feminine, or you know, trans women, like
mm-hmm.
you were a man, but then you chose to become a woman. You know, that
Yeah.
whole wrong idea. Um, the idea of being anything associated with feminine or female
Yeah.
is, you know, just thought of as lesser and weak. Glennon Doyle said in her new book, Untamed, that in talking about the fall, like the message of that story, the way she put it, is that the whole world fell apart because a woman wanted more. Like, how dare she? And
Wow.
because of that, all of humanity is doomed. And that just like really resonated with me. That absolutely is the message that we get.
Yeah.
So, so if you love Jesus and you know you want to serve his kingdom and bring him glory and all the things, and you're a woman, like you have to like really like do violence to yourself
Mm,
and let the church do violence to you in order to love Jesus according to that paradigm, which for most evangelical women is the only one they know.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's so tough. I remember when I released my series on homosexuality, I was doing loads and loads of study on the topic, trying to understand historically, you know, the different
Yeah.
biases and views of it. And I remember reading again and again and again in different cultures that in people that had a homosexual relationship, or I should say a homoerotic relationship, you know, they
Yeah.
physically would have sex with someone of the same sex. And we're talking
Uh-huh.
about men here because no one really cared about women having sex with women
Nope.
forever. Like for like
Yeah.
all of history, you can go back and it's basically everyone's kind of like, oh yeah, whatever.
Right.
But with men, and what's interesting is again and again and again in all these different cultures that you go into, the Mesopotamian culture, the Jewish culture, the Greek culture, the Roman culture, it was
Mhm.
the one who was penetrated was wrong, was bad, was evil, was whatever. And the one who
Mhm.
penetrated, well, that's nothing happened. It's fine. It's nothing was wrong.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and it was because to penetrate is masculine and to
Yep.
receive penetration is feminine. And so it was
Mhm.
much less about this sexual act between two men or two men having sex. That wasn't what was an offense to society. What was an
Right.
offense to society was a man acting as a woman as it was seen, right, to receive a
Right.
penis. um
Yes, being
and
penetrated.
that
Yeah.
was the big affront. It was the terrifying. I remember reading one account of I think it was the Romans, and they had gone into this city and they were literally massacring. They were killing. They were killing men, women, and children. Um,
Mhm.
you know, cutting them to bits. You know, mutilating them. Horrific stuff. And they went through this entire village and just
Yeah.
absolutely destroyed it. And the author is appalled by not that, but the fact they were wearing well, they were dressed as women, it says, and they wore makeup. And he was like, the fact that it was men pretending to be women who were then
Mhm.
doing these manly things, they just were so upset by this crossing
Mhm.
over the divide of what we have drawn a line in
Mhm.
the sand and said, no, men are over here, women over here, know your place, don't
Yeah.
mess with the line, don't cross that line at
Right.
that point.
Oh yeah.
And it was just a whole world I'd never really thought about or explored. And I think this is a big thing that is highlighted to me when looking at these things. Your seven kind of
Mhm.
uncertainty, vulnerability, all these things.
Yeah.
One of the things that is highlighted to me is that men don't tend to be immediately faced with as many problems when they deconstruct, because to a man who deconstructs, the issues of inequality are quote unquote a problem, but they're an intellectual problem,
Mhm.
my personal experience problem. If I go on believing this for another 10 years, I'm not going to suffer much. Now, you could argue,
Uh-huh.
well, actually, really, if people that you love are suffering, you're going to suffer. And, you know, if society suffers, we all suffer. You know, like, we could go into that. But on the
Sure.
whole, a man going to church who is told every week that women can't teach, it doesn't massively affect his opportunities in that
No.
church. It doesn't
Right.
massively affect, you know, how he gets on.
Right.
Whereas a woman starting to question these, it feels like there's a lot more categories. It's why I'd be intrigued. I'm hoping to look into
Mm-hmm.
race dynamics as well. You know,
Mm-hmm.
more likely that someone who's black or, you know, Latinx or you know, something
Mm-hmm.
that is other than white in a white evangelical church, are they more likely to leave church as they deconstruct than a
Mm-hmm.
white person? Because
Mm-hmm.
again, I think you're not suddenly just deconstructing, you're just deconstructing this whole component of colonization in church.
Yes.
You're deconstructing
Right.
patriarchy, you're deconstructing,
Yeah.
you know, there's extra tiers.
Uh-huh.
One thing I know we're kind of slowly coming to the end of our time, but something I'm really intrigued by, and I'd be intrigued by what you think of this, because um, this is to me some of the darkest the darkest side of this I've ever kind of come across. Is I used to, when I was much more in that world, in the evangelical world, and I was traveling, and I was personally not there anymore, but I was trying
Uh-huh.
to be there for the people and just help move them out. And so I'd go in and I'd teach certain things that were moving them in the right direction as I saw it, whether that's helpful or not, who knows. And
Sure.
one of the things I did was I did a series where I toured and spoke in, you know, 50, 60 churches on women in leadership, women in the church, you know, giving women more freedom and more
Mm-hmm.
liberty, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Mm-hmm.
thing that hit me again and again and again and again in every church was I would have this huge line of women waiting to speak to me at the end. And
Yeah.
a tiny fraction of them were there to say thank you. Most of them were there to attack me and say, don't you dare, you know, like, how dare you say that women are free? How dare you? And the men were largely silent on the whole. I had some lunches with pastors afterwards that were
Mm-hmm.
not pleased or, you know, different
Sure.
responses. And it's not that men didn't say anything, but I had this overwhelming response from women, but actually the overwhelming response was quite negative to that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think are the dynamics there that are going on, and how do we overcome those dynamics where,
Yeah.
to me, it almost feels like they've you know, the system has brainwashed its occupants, you know, like gaslighting
Mm-hmm.
and all that stuff, to the
Mm-hmm.
degree that
Mm-hmm.
women themselves are some of the most ardent supporters of their oppression,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is a heartbreaking thing. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe my anecdotal experience is very limited to the bubbles I spoke in. I don't know, but it was my experience, and I often think about that.
Yeah. Well, I think that women, especially evangelical women, have a lot of internalized misogyny.
Mm.
I think it helps us cope when we're in that environment. You know, if we tell ourselves that this is the right way because it's what God wants, it's what God says, and we want to be faithful to God, you know, you go along with that so that you don't have to entertain the fact that you're being oppressed, the fact that you're being hurt. um I mean, I had years of church attendance and not just attendance, but like, I mean, I was a pastor's wife, I was on the worship team, I, you know, did my time in like children's ministry, and you know, on the
Talk about a
rotation
jail
and everything.
sentence. I did my
What?
time in the children's ministry.
Oh, right. Well, let me just say, doing crafts with 4-year-olds is like the worst.
Yeah, and yet still more enjoyable than most sermons I've been in. Sorry. Anyway.
Well, I've heard some great sermons, but I've heard some terrible ones too. Um, so when you're really involved and you haven't entertained any of these questions,
Mm.
when someone brings them to your attention, like you're doing at these, you know, when you tour these churches, I think the immediate internal response is to resist that, because
Mm.
it's a threat to life as she knows it, you know, she being the evangelical woman hearing this. I mean, that was really my response to Sarah Bessey's book when I first read it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
You know, sort of the like, okay, yeah, this sounds great, but the Bible doesn't support this. And I was very, very faithful to my understanding of scripture. And I think women are in general. Evangelicals are in general. And you go along to get along. It's what you know. It's indoctrination. And I think, the ego does weird things. And I think one of the ego's first moves in that kind of situation is to reject, because something that's new is just immediately taken as a threat.
Yeah.
Because, what you're saying, the message of egalitarianism, well, that doesn't line up with what my pastor says, and my pastor couldn't be wrong. And that doesn't line up with how I read the Bible. And, it's the Bible. All you have to do is read it. Like, it's just, I think it's initially experienced as a threat, even though it's a message of liberation. If you don't know that you're in need of liberation, you're gonna just dismiss it. It makes me think of a Richard Rohr quote that I like a lot. He says something like, there's the path of liberating the enslaved, and that's the difficult path of Moses. And then there's the path of liberating the people who think they're free but are actually enslaved, which is the more difficult path of Jesus. And I think that's women in the evangelical church. That's maybe some people of color in the evangelical church, queer people in the evangelical church who have only heard their whole life that they're an abomination and they can never get married. You don't know. You just don't know until you know, and so even a message of liberation, when it's so different than what everyone you've always trusted has told you, I think the immediate human reaction is going to be to resist that.
Yeah.
Because the implications are devastating, and that's a lot to face. It takes a lot of courage to face the reality that you have been oppressed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is, it is oppression. It is, being a victim to a system that whether it was built from the ground up intentionally to oppress, or whether it evolved from a time that was just a different time and it just is refusing to move back forward and wants to move back, or all these different, we could pick apart that for months probably. I'm sure plenty of people do, but at the end of the day, it looks like really for people to be set free on a large scale. We could sit down with a friend and talk with them for a few months, years, and at some point that tipping point is hit and they realize, wow, I'm a victim to this system and it's holding me back, and I can find freedom. But it seems that ultimately the system needs to change. Do you have hope for the system, or do you think the system needs to die? Do you see change, or do you see death?
I have a lot of internal conflict about that question. Rachel Held Evans was really impactful to me. I read all of her books. I got to hear her speak. She was just like, she made me feel like someone understood before I could talk to like real life people about it. And I was listening to an interview with her her husband and her sister. And, I'm just like weeping because, it's just so sad that she died so young and tragically. And her sister said something about how Rachel never gave up on the church. Like, she was very critical of it, but she never gave up on it. And that just brought on all the tears. And like, that really resonates with me. I definitely have days where I'm just like, burn it all down. Like, this is all toxic. This is all bad. I hate it. But then I have like that stirring that I mentioned to you where like, I want to go to church with my husband, and I want us to have a life of faith that we, enjoy together. And so I do feel a desire for like reform, even if that reform comes in the form of destroying what exists and
Yeah.
then building something completely new. And sometimes I feel kind of silly, like, oh, Halley, like, just, you can't sit at the deconstruction cool kids table if you don't want to just like screw church. Um, but yeah, like Anne Lamott said when she became a Christian, she talks in her book about, or one of her books, she likens Jesus to like this stray cat that just like wouldn't leave her alone. And at the end, she's like, oh, F it, you can come in. And that's how she describes her conversion. And for me, like deconstruction has been like that. Like I can't get Jesus out.
Yeah.
And of course, Jesus and church are two totally different things. But I mean, to say another Richard Rohr quote, we criticize the things that we love. Like if I could care less about the church, I don't think I would be writing about it.
No.
I don't think that I would be this upset about the trauma that people experience. I would just be like, well, that was a load of BS and let's move on.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. I am very critical of the evangelical church, but I still have some hope for some kind of church.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love it. I'm probably with you as well, and I hear you. It feels like, at least in certain parts of deconstructing Christianity, the path is anarchy or nothing, or
right.
But and I'm an anarchist by default anyway, so it's hard not to like gravitate. But I see people that love this person of Jesus and want to forge a path of making the world look more like what Jesus expressed as an ideology, and I think
right.
I think there's a beautiful opportunity for that group of people, an ideology, whatever that is, an expression to exist, to be an amazing thing. I just don't think that it's the common expression of it right now. We probably, if it's out there, it's a smaller minority.
Right. And I definitely understand, my friends who just don't want anything to do with the church or with the label of Christian. Like I am not a Christian anymore. Just the idea of like, I want to distance myself from that.
Yeah.
For me, that was experienced more as, no, this belongs to me. Like this is part of my identity. And like, you can't take this from me. You can't take Jesus from me. You can't take my identity from me. And yes, I have remade it. And y'all think I'm like this horrible heretic now, but this still belongs to me. And I'm not going to just hand it over.
That's awesome. Well, Halley, thank you so much for spending so much time chatting with me and just sharing your journey, your story, your thoughts, letting me constantly interrupt you and ask questions.
You're great.
But how can people track with you and follow you? I follow you on Instagram and I love the stuff you're posting. I love going through your stories and checking out your profile. Is that the best place for people to connect with you?
Yeah, so everything I post on Instagram, I also post on Facebook. Okay. So my Instagram handle is Halley, HALLEY.Kim, and then a underscore. And then my Facebook one is slightly different. I don't know, for some reason, Facebook pages are weird and it didn't like any other name that I wanted to use. It's Halley_Kim, and it's all the same content that I put on Instagram.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I know some people are stuck in the dark ages and still on Facebook, so they'll appreciate it. Because some of the people I have on, because most people I meet through Instagram, they're like, I'm only on Instagram, and then people complain to me, and I'm like, that's not my problem.
Yeah. So sometimes I wonder why I still post on Facebook. I always get like, there's like 6 likes, and on Instagram there might be like 100, and I'm like, what's happening here?
It's a different world, isn't it? Yeah. I've got like twice as many people following me on Facebook, and I probably have about 1/10 of the engagement.
Yes. It's bizarre.
Really weird. But
I also have a blog that's a bit neglected, but it's halleykim.com.
Awesome. Perfect. I'll get that on there as well. So I'll make sure those are in the show notes for people.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
I
enjoyed finally meeting you. We've chatted so much on Instagram. It's nice to have a proper face to put to the person. And
absolutely. Same.
All right. Well, have a good day. And
you
I'll speak to you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Phil.
Bye.
Bye.